Welcome to UNAM Chicago's CAFÉ EXPRESSO, a space for bilateral conversations with people from all walks of life. Tune in to Spanish Public Radio and follow us on social media. And now your host, Alberto Foncerrada.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Café Expresso. My name is Alberto Foncerrada, and I am your host. Café Expresso is a program of UNAM Chicago in alliance with Spanish Public Media. Today, I'm very happy to welcome my guest, Rachel Bronson. Rachel Bronson is the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, it's nice to be here today.
So nice to see you. I met Rachel a while back when I was working for the Mexican consulate, and she was the vice president for studies at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. That's way back.
Yeah, probably about more than 10 years ago now.
Exactly. I'm just gonna tell you a little bit about Rachel. Well, she's a very prolific writer. Her writings have appeared all over in publications such as Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, The National Interest, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, the Chicago Tribune, etc. She has appeared as a commentator in numerous radio and television outlets, including NPR, CNN, Al Jazeera, PBS, and The Daily Show, and a long list of etceteras. Well, Rachel, welcome to the program. Rachel is as I said, she's the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and you oversee the publishing programs, the management of the Doomsday Clock, and a growing set of activities around nuclear risk, climate change, and disruptive technologies. Can we break down some of these for our audience? First of all, what is the Doomsday Clock and the Bulletin?
Yeah, maybe I'll start very quickly with the Bulletin, and then the Doomsday Clock will make a little bit more sense.
Yes.
So the Bulletin was founded in 1945 by Manhattan Project scientists, the scientists who discovered and then weaponized nuclear energy. And the magazine, or the Bulletin, if you will, was created by those scientists who were thinking about the consequences of the science and technology that they were developing. So it was many refugees from Europe. They understood how science, during World War II, they understood how science and technology could be used for good and for evil. They wanted to make sure that the public was engaged and understood that technology was moving very quickly, but also was moving in a way that eventually would have global consequences. And so they created this black and white 6-page bulletin to serve as their voice. It was 1945. That was the communication channel of the day. That was the Twitter of the day. That was the TikTok of the day. And so they began writing. And the goal, they had 3 goals in mind set out of what they wanted to do with this publication. And those goals still drive us today. The first was to engage the public on the future of nuclear energy. Still a very, very important topic, has consequences for climate change and civilian energy use. We're powering spaceships with nuclear energy up to Jupiter, radiation treatments, but also obviously nuclear weapons. So they wanted to engage the public on this dual-use technology, which had terrible consequences. Obviously, we're still living with it today, as we know from following this with Ukraine. The second goal for the Bulletin was to create a space for scientists who wanted to engage policymakers and the public. Right? Even today, there's a debate: should scientists and engineers stay in their laboratories, or should they come out and be engaged in the political process to help guide the rules and regulations around their technology? The third, which is what I find the most interesting, was it was created to manage the dangerous presence of Pandora's box of modern science, recognizing that every technology has risks and rewards, and you can't benefit from the rewards if you manage the risks. And so currently what the organization does is we focus on the advancement of technology and how it might change and to some extent end life on Earth as we know it. So we focus on nuclear risk, climate change, and new disruptive technologies. And in those disruptive technologies, we mean things like artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, genetic engineering, the creation of new viruses for both to help guard against them and also cause them. So the Bulletin today, to answer then the question with that background, is a digital media outlet. You can find us at thebulletin.org, publishing every day, free, available to public, leading experts working on nuclear risk, climate change, and disruptive technologies. We also publish a subscription magazine, and we manage the Doomsday Clock. So I'm happy to turn to that.
Yes, exactly. What is the Doomsday Clock?
So the Doomsday Clock is a metaphor for how close humanity is to destroying itself. It's as grisly and as simple as that. And it was created by an artist in 1947 to serve as the first cover of the first magazine of the Bulletin. So I just said that the Bulletin was created in 1945, black and white 6-page publication. 2 years later, in 1947, they turned it into a magazine. And Time magazine, Life magazine, he needed a great cover. And so one of the Manhattan Project scientists was married to an artist who they asked to create the first cover, and she created this clock. It was first set at 7 minutes to midnight, and it was like this very powerful representation of art and science coming together, because what the clock showed universally, without any language needed, that the situation was urgent. It was 7 minutes to midnight and ticking forward, but it also suggests an element of hope, which is that we can always turn it back. And so this clock moves backwards and forwards towards midnight, which is the end of life on Earth as we know it, and away from midnight. So that's what, it's a metaphor, it's an artist design. But what happened was, the first cover of the first magazine was set at 7 minutes to midnight. 2 years later, when the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, the editor of the Bulletin moved it closer to midnight. And then in 1953, when both countries tested hydrogen bombs, significantly more powerful, he moved it again towards midnight. And so he took this static representation and he made it dynamic. And ever since, we've been moving the clock forwards and backwards based on, is humanity safer today than it was last year when we said it, or since the founding of it, which is a question I ask my board each year. And so each year we announce the time on the Doomsday Clock. It's been as far away as 17 minutes to midnight. That's the furthest. In 1991, after the end of the Cold War, when a set of arms control agreements came into place. And it's been as close as 100 seconds to midnight, which is where we are now, signifying a very, very dangerous moment in our history. And we take into consideration nuclear risk, climate change, and how disruptive technologies may affect or not affect those two existential issues.
Wow, that is really fascinating. Scary in some ways, but wow. So we're pretty close, 100 seconds, you said.
Yeah, and so you're right, it is pretty scary. And what's been really interesting is the Bulletin's been pretty steadily moving the hands of the Doomsday Clock forward since 2010.
Mm-hmm.
So 2010 was really the last time we pushed it away, and that was that's a new arms control agreement, new start between the Russians and the US, right? So those two countries control 90% of the world's nuclear weapons. And They had a very important agreement that limited and promised to reduce the number of warheads. But since then, we've been moving it closer to midnight. Climate change has a big piece of it, but I'm going to focus mostly on the nuclear side just because of today's current events, although climate is part of today's events, but just because of what everyone's thinking about in Ukraine. So we've been steadily moving it towards midnight for a number of reasons. One is the deterioration of U.S.-Russian relations, which have been really, trending downwards for over a decade now. Very dangerous. And we've been moving it forward because every major nuclear power is investing in their nuclear weapons in a way to suggest that they're more and not less usable. And we've been moving it forward because of arms control agreements are really falling by the wayside. We have very few of them left, and very few agreements that are containing or constraining nuclear weapons. We've been moving it forward for very similar reasons on climate, and we've been very concerned about the deterioration of the distrust and the mistrust and the distrust of experts and misinformation, disinformation. We talk about that a lot in our statement. So every year when we set the time, we issue a report. We call it our clock statement, which explains why we've set the time where we have. And so 2 years ago, we had moved it to 100 seconds to midnight. We kept it there last January, and we've kept it there since. And we're under a lot of pressure now as to like when and why aren't we moving it? When might we move it? In light of the current situation in Ukraine, which I'm happy to talk about why we've kept it there, but that's where we're at. So before we maybe get to that though, what's interesting is we have been saying it's really dangerous. And I think often the public will rightfully look at it and say, what are you talking about? You know, it's not that dangerous. But we see in what we're playing out in Ukraine now, and just the quick move to nuclear use and the lack of, we see now kind of what are the things that our experts were saying and they were so concerned about is exactly where we're at now, is all of the things we were worrying about as we kind of moving it closer and closer to midnight are very much in play now.
For sure, for sure. Now, let me ask you something. We're talking about, well, current events, and there's a lot of concern, but what about before this all happened? For example, during the Trump administration, people talked about, is this safe that someone with his personality, and I don't want to put you on the spot or anything talking about personalities, but there was worry about some sectors of society thinking like, can this man be in charge of the nuclear button, or have there been cases where there's really concern about just one person? I know that we're talking about the other side of the world now, but wasn't there a concern before this all happened?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're not putting me on the spot. Nancy Pelosi, sent a note out to, generals and fellow representatives saying, this can't be the appropriate structure. So what you're referring to right now is something that experts talk about as sole authority, whether one person should have the sole authority to launch a set of weapons that will end life on Earth as we know it. It's the most undemocratic right that we give to anyone. And in the United States, it is true. The president has the sole authority to issue nuclear weapons. So even leaving personalities aside, and I know we don't need to, but even if we set it aside, the notion of sole authority, which is in place for military and strategic reasons, is the most undemocratic, kind of worrisome right that we give to a president in the United States. And so there is a movement, and we talk about it at the Bulletin. We write a lot of like, how would you mitigate sole authority? who could you add into that decision process that wouldn't affect the strategic balance and the speed with which a president would need to respond, but actually can represent the people, right? And so then you put somebody like a president who seems to be very cavalier and somewhat reckless about the use of nuclear weapons, right? You'll remember during the Trump administration when the North Koreans were testing their nuclear weapons, and the president said, you know, my button is bigger than your button. I mean, you know, references to such serious catastrophic weapons, it raises it even further. So we haven't moved it forward per se because of sole authority, because that hasn't changed in decades. But you're right to point to the fact that it is a very dangerous arrangement that puts that kind of control into the hands of one single person.
I actually, you wrote a piece, I can see that more hands needed on the nuclear football, and you wrote it in 2021. So I think you talk a little bit about that and the risks. Now, with regards to what's happening in the other side of the world, how concerned are you? Is this are we dealing with a madman?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of people trying to figure out what's going on in the minds of Vladimir Putin, and I don't know whether we're dealing with a madman or not. But what I do know is it is very dangerous. He's brandishing nuclear weapons in part to scare and terrorize everybody. So he's doing that as a instrument of conflict and war. And so we want to be careful in how we respond. But what he's threatening is very dangerous, and it is very scary. And we are taking it very seriously, and we should all take it very seriously. I think the part of, is it a madman or not? The challenge is that Vladimir Putin has long been regarded as a cold-hearted strategist or tactician who really thinks about both what he's doing tactically and how that fits strategically with the advancement of Russian interests. May disagree on what those interests are, but he's very cold and calculating and thoughtful about it. And this situation we find ourselves in seems to be such an overstep and such a blunder, so far that puts so much of Russian interests at risk, let alone what is happening to the Ukrainian people and the country, but just the world watching him miscalculate the Ukrainian response, miscalculate the Western response, push Russia further to the margins rather than pulling it into the center of global diplomacy and politics where he wants to be, marginalizing relations between Ukraine and Russia, which has been trying to slowly co-opt. So I think that's what's so terrifying about this, is it seemed, madman or not, he made a huge blunder and we're all watching it. He can't hide it. He can't pretend it didn't happen. He's just put Russian interests on the table in a way from a position of weakness. And so what's terrifying is, how does he get out of this? Does he have to escalate to try to create something so that he can maybe find a victory in this, because he's not finding it in the current situation, and withdrawal doesn't get him that. And so trying to find the paths out are really hard. So I don't know whether he's a madman or not, but he definitely overstepped, and it's at the costing thousands of Russians' lives and thousands of Ukraine, but millions of Ukrainians on the move, and the destruction of these historic and beautiful cities. So yeah, I'm very worried. I'm very worried because he is talking about nuclear weapons. We know that in Syria, chemical weapons are used. He seems to be setting up rationales for bio attacks or cyber attacks or chemical attacks. We're thinking about what, tactical nuclear weapons have never been used in conflict, and it seems on the table now. So, and what's the response to that? So yes, I am worried, we are worried, and we're taking it very seriously.
Oh, now I think we all share that worry, but in some way, are you optimistic that that we're going to get through this?
Well, I think we have to be. So am I feeling optimistic? It's pretty grim, but like we have to be, right? That's what we all have to be working towards, hoping for, thinking about, trying to figure out what this way out is. Like we have to believe there is a way out so that we can find it. And I think that's where all the debates are over, no fly zones or let this keep the skies open. Like it's all trying to figure out how do you very subtly move away from even worst case scenarios. How do we end this? How do we get the Ukrainians, some of them at least, back home? But how do we avoid the use of weapons of mass destruction on the European continent? It's just so incredible that we're having this conversation, and yet we are. So we have to be optimistic. We have to find a way. And I think for all of us, we also have to allow our politicians to come up with solutions that might be less than perfect to try to reduce the suffering that currently exists and what is certainly possible.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Rachel Bronson, I want to thank you so much for these minutes that you devoted to me. I'm going to be reaching out to you. We're going to have some international events coming up, and I know that you're always involved in these things. And hopefully, we can engage our university with in some capacity with what you're doing. But I really, really want to thank you for this. This has been very enlightening, I'm sure, for all our audience in Mexico and here.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you. I hope next time it's under happier circumstances.
I hope so too. And to my audience, this has been another edition of Café Expresso. My name is Alberto Foncerrada, and I am your host. Café Expresso is a program of UNAM Chicago in alliance with Spanish Public Media. Until next time.